it's time for Toker Talk Radio, the voice of the marijuana nation.
What are you people? On dope?
Where you can toke.
I inhale frequently.
Or you can talk.
I experimented with marijuana and didn't inhale.
Or you can toke and talk.
10 federal criminal penalties for possession of up to 1 ounce of marijuana.
While we talk about toke on Toker Talk Radio.
So, by the way, when it comes to pot, if you're 40 years old, you live in a log cabin in Oregon, you got 12 giant pot plants in your backyard, have a ball.
Live from beautiful Portland, Oregon at Rolla J Studios.
Hey, this is great. Just not cannabis.
Plus your calls live at 971-533-7111.
They're walking on their pants with their cap on backwards, listening to Enema Man and Snoopy Poop Dog.
What's to keep somebody from getting all potted up on weed and then getting behind the wheel? Gateway theory doesn't work. It's a reality.
Holland, is it real? Don't tease me.
We're locking up people that take a couple of puffs of marijuana, and the next thing you know, they got 10 years.
And now, here's your host, the guru of ganja graphics, the sultan of sativa statistics, and the worst nightmare of a reefer mad prohibitionist. A polite, perspicacious, productive pothead with a propensity for PowerPoint. Radical Russ Belville.
Good day, tokers and tokettes and non-toking lovers of liberty. Radical Russ still here in the cafeteria of the United Nations building, getting you ready for Toker Talk Radio. And if you were listening yesterday, we played for you part one of a symposium at the Cannabis Science and Policy Summit that was held Sunday and Monday at the City University of New York. Mark Kleiman and Botech and New York University were sponsors of this, and it featured some of us from the pro-marijuana legalization side, but also a few of them from the anti-marijuana legalization side. We'll hear a little bit more from them in this part two of the panel of treating cannabis as a temptation good.
Thank you, John. It's everything we had hoped for. I should point out that I had the death by chocolate cake once, but it only made me stronger. So we now have an all-star cast of commentators, and we're going to start with David Courtwright, the irreplaceable historian of drugs and other things from the University of North Florida. David, take it away.
Thank you, Mark. 50 or 60 years ago, marijuana was a criminalized drug, and tobacco was a supermarket commodity. Since then, of course, the tables have been turned. U.S. per capita tobacco consumption is roughly half of what it was in 1964, the year that Attorney General Luther Terry announced that smoking caused lung cancer. And of course, the bad news continued to pile up. And so in 2014, there was a Wall Street Journal poll asking Americans which of these four substances do you think is most harmful. The responses, as you see, were 49% tobacco, 24% alcohol, 15% sugar, and 8% marijuana. But less harmful is not more harmful. Less harmful is not unharmful, But marijuana lacks the equivalent of lung cancer or environmental tobacco smoke or overdose deaths. It is still a dependence-inducing drug that can cause personal, familial, and social problems. To quote our keynoter, marijuana is a performance, or can be a performance-degrading drug that we should perhaps call a temptation commodity. This from his recent article in the National Interest. Your conference program defines broadly temptation goods as those that make us more prone to generate unwanted habits and that would lead us to regrettable choices. So I'm a historian, and I guess the question that confronts me is whether or not there are historical models for minimizing the harms of temptation goods. In the case of cannabis, one model from history doesn't apply, and that is the fixed profit public trust, like the Gothenburg system of the 19th century. Under this arrangement, Private distillation of alcohol was banned. Shareholder profits in the alcohol monopoly were capped at 5%. Revenues went to community recreational projects like parks, for example. Publicans received fixed incomes, and they enforced rules such as no treating, no gambling or prostitution on the premises, and of course no sales to minors or intoxicated persons. One disappointed English sailor returned to ship after just 2 hours of liberty in Gothenburg, saying, "I have never been in such a place. It is impossible to get drunk." The Goths, as regulated public houses came to be affectionately known, emphasized the sale of food as well as drink. At this surviving Goth in East Lothian, Scotland, you can get gluten-free fish and chips along with your folk music and your microbrewed ale. It was built in 1908 and it still operates according to the Gothenburg principles of its founders. By encouraging sensible drinking in a salubrious environment, Goths offered a cultural message of moderation, as well as, of course, an alcoholic beverage or beverages. Industrialists, progressive union leaders, and temperance advocates all got behind that message, showing that it was possible for disparate factions in society to unite behind an experimental control system aimed at curbing profiteering, commercialization, and social costs. So what might Goth pot look like? Here's a sketchy thought experiment from someone who admittedly makes his living looking at the past rather than the future, but by analogy, Goth pot would entail a monopoly on legal production, a ban on all but basic tombstone-style advertising, retail outlets limited in number and location, selling products of regulated purity and potency, companion sales of non-intoxicating food and drink, and staff who worked on salary rather than commission. Off-premise cannabis consumption would be allowed, though the latter would be tied to a rationing proposal that Mark Lyman made nearly a quarter century ago, namely personal consumption licenses with quantity limits. Would there still be diversion, illicit production, and smuggling? Of course there would be. However, the behavior of 19th century narcotic imports suggests that the black market activity would be proportional to the after-tax price. Now, I've done most of my number crunching with respect to opiates, not cannabis. Still, I've noticed the price matters a lot. The optimal strategy would be to start with a relatively low Goth pot tax, let the black market proceed, and then titrate the tax to higher levels, something that the alcohol historian Bill Rohrabach claims that Washington State did with considerable success after repeal in 1933. Another American legalization success story was Dr. Willis Butler's narcotic clinic in operation from 1919 to 1923. Butler, the parish coroner, gradually detoxified some addicts and provided long-term maintenance for others. He kept morphine prices just high enough to cover his overhead, but low enough to deter back alley peddlers. He maintained order and decorum with the help of local police officials who backed his project. It helped a lot that 2 former U.S. district attorneys and the mother of the Commissioner of Public Safety were patients at the clinic. Now, what did the Goth pubs and the Shreveport Narcotic Clinic have in common? They were non- or minimal profit entities with community backing that provided community benefits and had cooperation from local law enforcement. Take the profit out of it, a policy wand often waved against the black market might as easily be waved against socially risky illicit market expansion. For temptation goods, what is sauce for the policy goose is sauce for the policy gander. So the good news is that history offers example of drug control experiments that avoided extremes of commercialization and prohibition. The bad news admittedly, is that these regimes tend to be fragile and imperfect. You've already heard about cross-border effects from Jonathan. Politicians can also be as tempted by revenues as private entrepreneurs. That's why John Burnham thinks that many alcohol control experiments failed after 1933, the desperate need for revenue during Prohibition. And we all know that even in good times, or relatively good times, state legislators can decide to, say, expand the lottery, which we've seen in the last century. So finally, this is my last point, I want to ask whether the distinction between hard drugs and lethal risks, hard drugs with lethal risks and temptation goods with more amorphous risks, marijuana, gambling, social media, etc., holds up to close inspection. I ask because temptation goods are continuously being hedonically weaponized. They are becoming more numerous, more affordable, more available, more anonymous, and more seductive. You've all heard the argument, it's not your father's marijuana. Well, it's not your father's slot machine, it's not your father's video arcade game, it's not your father's pornography, and it's not your father's phone. When Nancy Joel Sales interviewed recently 200 teenage girls about social media use, she found that the words addicted and addiction, obsessed and obsessing came up again and again. How else, she writes, can you characterize an activity that occupies from 9 to 11 hours of your day? Good question. Like portable social media, hyper-palatable food, loaded with sugar, salt, and fat, is calculated to maximize brain reward and to encourage heavy habitual consumption. In some aisles of the supermarket, it's hard to know what's not a temptation good. I mean, maybe the aspirin or the Tums that provide derivative profits from overindulgence. And calling these things temptation goods doesn't necessarily mean that they aren't deadly. Obesity and diabetes from hyperpalatable foods can kill you. Texting while driving can kill you and other people. 1 in 5 problem gamblers attempts suicide. And subpar performance, this is my last slide, and subpar performance from anything, cannabis included, affects longevity, especially among males. Let's be honest. Ours is an inegalitarian society that punishes degraded performance and lower cognitive ability with lower status and lower income. The stress-mediated connection between lower status and lower income and having a shorter, sicker life is well established. Indeed, one reason suburban parents reacted so strongly against the increase in cannabis use in the late 1970s was that they feared pot as a symbol and a cause of a déclassé life, with all that meant for the physical and moral well-being of their children. If we combine research from the field of social factors in medicine with Jonathan Hawkins' sobering talk, we should conclude that their fears were not entirely unreasonable. Downward mobility is bad for your health. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thanks for raising the license and quota idea, which I am indeed questioning. I should point out there are 2 versions of the personal user license with a quota. One would have the quota set by the state. That was the old Swedish spirits system. The other, that seems to be more consistent with American political culture, would be to have the quota set by the user and resettable, but with a lag, but enforceable in the meantime. Think of it as a way of giving the long-term planning self, if I can invoke the spirit of Tom Schelling, a fighting chance against the impulsive self. So, our next commenter will be Rob McCoon of Stanford, who's been in this business almost as long as I have. And it's a great pleasure to welcome.
Do you have my slides? Does someone have my slides? Slide number 1. I don't have any slides. I submitted some slides. That's fine. The title of my talk is Cannabis Revenue as the Temptation Good. And John, I want to go over a few of John's key points. John suggests national legalization probably on the alcohol model is very likely. That long-run consumption may at least double. That prices matter. And John illustrates powerfully, I think, that the quantity consumed may matter more than how many people consume. And I think that's a really key point. And John mentions that there are lots of different policy levers that might be used to try to influence patterns of use and raise the question of whether we're thinking through all the different levers that we should be using. So I want to talk about some of these points. And first, I really want to take up the point of whether national legalization of marijuana is inevitable. I think a lot of people think there's some inexorable historical movement there. I don't think it's inevitable at all. I think it's, what's the opposite of inevitable? It's evitable. I think it's evitable. I think it's useful to remind ourselves that we still have 45.5 states to go. DC is only sort of halfway legalized, so most states have not legalized. Certainly more states will legalize, including I'm sure my own state is going to legalize in November. I think I'm fairly confident of that. President Cruz could put a stop to it. President Bryan could put a stop to it. Even President Clinton could put a stop to it. President Clinton will not spend any political capital protecting marijuana, I think, if she's got other fish to fry. And we're probably looking at a Republican House and Senate. So what happens if Colorado and Washington and Oregon blow it? They could blow it. We don't know yet. And there are various ways they could blow it. One way is if consumption really starts spiraling out of control. One of the problems we have as drug policy analysts is that the National Household Survey state-level data comes out very slowly, and even then they aggregate across 2 years because the sample sizes are really too small. It wasn't really designed to evaluate state interventions. And so we still don't fully know even what the early results look like, much less anything like some sort of equilibrium results. Let's consider the headline, carload of Utah football players killed in fatal crash after drug tourism. That headline hasn't happened yet. It could happen. And could get a lot of attention there. So there are a lot of things that could go wrong. And in this slide, I show you that while support for legalization among baby boomers has skyrocketed in recent years, it actually plummeted between 1975 and 1990. It was actually declining. So there's no Hegelian inexorable movement that we only move in one direction. Things can change. And that means that this is a delicate time. And it's a delicate time for the industry to really think about how to design legalization to be sustainable. After years of saying a criminal justice approach doesn't work, we need a public health approach, now it's time to show what we mean by what does a public health approach look like. So I think in particular we need to think a lot about John's point that a lot of the money that's going to be made is going to be made by the tail end of these extremely heavy sort of wake and bake users who start every day using and use throughout the day. And that's where the money's going to be, and that's where the push is going to be. John mentioned a doubling. There are two ways of thinking about a doubling. one way I think about a doubling is a doubling of prevalence, the number of people using. And my students are always shocked when I tell them, actually, just a particular example, I had a student recently, we were talking about state legislation, and the student said these state legislators probably have never even seen marijuana. And I just kind of smiled, and I said, well, statistically, they've seen a lot more marijuana than you have. Yeah. And they looked at me like, what? So I put up a slide, and I showed that there were about twice as many marijuana users in 1979 as there are today. So in one sense, we know what a doubling of use is like, and the sky didn't fall. We had some pretty bad music. Well, we had the Clash. I don't know. It was okay. But there's a very different sense of doubling that John mentioned, and this is one that I don't think was on anybody's radar screen a decade ago. And this is the doubling of, not of how many people are using, but this massive growth in daily use, suggesting that in one sense, my students really are being exposed to a very different world of marijuana than the world I was exposed to in college. Now, Peter Reuter and I, in our book, that please buy it quickly before it goes any further out of date, because like every day that passes, it gets just more and more archaic. But there's one timeless bit of wisdom in the book that I think holds up, and it's actually, you don't have to buy the book, because I can summarize the whole book right now for you. The key to the book is that legalization almost certainly reduces average harm per dose of a substance. Legalization almost certainly increases the number of doses that are consumed. The net effect is the product of average harm per dose, the number of doses. So average harm will go down, doses will go up. Total harm, that product, could go up or it could go down. It depends on which of the two mechanisms is stronger. And that's the situation we're in right now, is I think we're going to be looking at a lot more marijuana use, possibly safer marijuana use. Peter and I actually, one thing we said in the book, and I haven't asked Peter if he agrees, but one thing we said in the book is the average user under legalization will be a safer user. And the logic was that the new users will be people who wouldn't use under prohibition, so they have enough self-control to obey the law. The one reason I'm not sure that's entirely correct is because I don't think we fully imagine all the ways in which an industry can change a product in ways that might actually be harm promoting. And I'm thinking about edibles and this dramatic increase in potency. Yeah, for a long time, marijuana reformers were skeptical of the government claims that potency was increasing. And for good reason, because the government data is based on police activities, police seizures, so it's nothing like a random sample. So I recently collected data on 105 contestants from 1994 to 2011 in the High Times Cannabis Cup. And 36 of them list THC potency, and the mean potency was 19%, well above the federal figures. By the way, the mean CBD content was 1.4%. And what was striking to me was that the higher the THC, the higher the ranking in the awards. The most potent forms of marijuana were most likely to win. And in fact, the winning recipe is to have a strain with high THC and low CBD. Now, from a harm reduction standpoint, that's a questionable mix. And I'm not suggesting we shouldn't have any high potency products. But there should be products available that people can integrate into their daily lives without getting flat out blitzed. And it's increasingly difficult for people to do that with high potency marijuana. So if I had my slides, that's one thing I definitely can't do with my slides, is I was just briefly going to show you. So, what I'm working on right now in trying to think through these issues is, after years of reading debates about the harms of marijuana and the consequences of potency, I've been trying to do some computer modeling in which the point of the modeling is not to forecast. In fact, the point of my modeling is precisely to show how vast our ignorance is. And what I do in the modeling is I make reasonable, I use reasonable equations that describe dose response curves and so on, and data we do have about consumption, but I vary assumptions about tolerance and titration, and try to show just how unforeseeable it is what the consequences of continuing to increase potency will have. In some regions of my model, we can increase potency and it's absolutely fine because people titrate their doses and tolerance is high. In other regions of my model, people either can't or don't titrate and the tolerance isn't as great and harms go way up. And I have no idea where in that parameter space we are, and you don't either. We're all going to find out.
After the final comment, we're going to go to your questions. Note that instruction on the bottom left from your side of the screen. So that's how you get questions on the agenda. We've got a few of them already. Now my great honor to introduce Wayne Hall, who will wrap up the comments, and then we'll go to your questions. Wayne?
Thanks, Mark, and thanks for the invitation to be here. I'll be brief because I know there'll probably be lots of questions that the audience will like to ask of our speaker and our commentators. I want to talk a bit about alcohol and cannabis because it's the comparison that's been made in John's talk, and it's one that's frequently made. I became fairly briefly infamous back in 1999 along with Robin Room for publishing a paper which said that cannabis was less harmful than alcohol. That's sort of now regarded as sort of a truism. And that sort of comparison has been central to the case made for liberalisation or legalisation of cannabis, and for understandable reasons. The comparison clearly favours cannabis for the reasons that John reminded us of. You don't have the same sorts of acute risks that people face with alcohol. People die of alcohol overdoses. There's accidents, violence and suicide, which are clearly related to intoxication with alcohol, which we don't see clearly with cannabis. And heavy drinkers develop cirrhosis and cancers and various neurological disorders that we also don't see with cannabis. So the comparison looks like a no-brainer and a knockdown argument for legalisation. The additional appeal of the argument, of course, is from the argument for hypocrisy. Why is it that a much less harmful drug is prohibited while a more dangerous one is freely available? But the comparisons usually stop there, and I want to sort of spell out some of the other aspects of comparison, particularly around policy and what we've learned from alcohol. I'd also make the point that the comparisons that we make about the adverse health effects of cannabis and alcohol, particularly the public health impacts, are clearly confounded by its current legal status. The low public health impacts of cannabis at least partially reflect the effects of prohibition. There are far fewer regular cannabis users, there have been until reasonably recently, than there have been regular drinkers, and most people who have been heavy cannabis users, their use careers have been much shorter than the comparable careers of people who became heavy drinkers. So I think we need to remember that those facts may well change and are likely to change under a legalisation regime. Jonathan's paper, not the ones from which he presented today, but the one that was published earlier this year, I think also makes the point that the comparisons of dependence potential of cannabis and alcohol sort of can be potentially misleading. I mean, I've cited the figures of James Anthony and others that the proportion of people who ever use cannabis who develop dependence is around 9% as against 15%. I think there's a couple of things we need to remember in citing that figure. One, it's a historical figure, it's not a biological law of nature that only 9% of cannabis users develop dependence. It reflects the situation of the early 1990s when the National Comorbidity Study was conducted. The other point I think that Jonathan's made is that the comparison is not a fair one in the sense that the proportion of people who ever use cannabis often enough to put themselves at serious risk of dependence is a hell of a lot less than the proportion of people who do the same for alcohol. So he estimated, I think, for the late 1990s, that about a third of people who'd ever used cannabis used more than 100 times, which is a sort of rule of thumb that people with tobacco use as a way of defining people who are at risk of becoming dependent on nicotine. I was prompted with Michael Linsky, a colleague, to look at some Australian twin data from people who used cannabis in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s in Australia. And we found that only about a quarter of people in that sample had used as frequently as often as 100 times. But amongst those who had used 100 times, the proportion who met criteria for dependence was over half. So I think that's something we need to remember in facile comparisons of simple capture rates. I think the other point that's been well made in this talk is that the use, heavy use, or the proportion of cannabis use that's accounted for by daily users is quite high, and it looks just like alcohol, tobacco, and gambling. But the people who use in moderation, who don't put themselves at risk, account for a very small proportion of total consumption. Wendy Swift and I did calculations or estimates of that back in Australia in the late 1990s and came up with very similar estimates to those that Jonathan has put to us today in his paper. I'd echo Rob McKeown's cautions about potential changes and adverse health effects post-legalisation. For a long time, the argument was contested that there had in fact been an increase in potency. I don't think it's arguable that there has, and we've seen all sorts of innovations in the legal cannabis market in Colorado around edibles, and increased reports of user misadventures in unintentional overdose and accidental poisoning of children. There are also worrisome concerns around the development of concentrates of butane oil extracts producing THC product or THC contents up in the 40% range. It's a bit hard to know what the potential risks of the ready availability of very highly potent products like that might be. So I think we do need to be aware of potential risks. I was recently involved with the WHO, the World Health Organization, in updating their evaluation of the adverse health effects of cannabis, and most of what we came up with wasn't too surprising. The large area of surprise was the worrying numbers of reports from France and parts of Europe of serious cardiovascular events in young men who've been very, very heavy cannabis smokers, and it's always been smoking in these particular cases. I'm talking about strokes and coronary syndromes occurring in otherwise healthy young people. Now, so far the evidence is largely case control studies and increased risks of cardiovascular attendance in emergency room departments. But this could become more common if we allow the ready availability of very high potency products that people continue to smoke. And clearly there's a regulatory opportunity there under legalisation that is not available under prohibition, but it's something that we need to look at. I think the evidence around psychosis and very high potent products is also strengthened, particularly for work done in London by Marta Forti and colleagues. And I think there's emerging evidence from the Global Drug Survey that people who use more potent product report more symptoms of dependence and are more likely to report emergency room attendances. So I don't think we can dismiss the risks of increased potency as well. They're not going to be an issue because people will titrate their dose. But returning to the alcohol analogy, people who are incomplete titrators of alcohol, people drink spirits, they tend to drink more, drink to higher levels of intoxication than when they drink lower alcohol content beverages like beer. It would be amazing and surprising if the same weren't true of high potency cannabis products. So again, I think the legalisation, regulation really does need cannabis cognitive and social performance. I agree with Jonathan that cannabis is a performance-degrading drug, and it's fairly clear from the epidemiological literature that daily cannabis use in particular amongst young people is associated with early school dropout, and amongst older adults in the New Zealand cohort studies with higher rates of welfare dependence, lower rates of employment, and generally poorer self-reported quality of life. And of course the argument is this a consequence of the cannabis use, or is it characteristic of the sort of people who are attracted to heavy daily use? And of course advocates of legalisation argue that it's the user, not the drug. The consequence, or the implication of which, is that cannabis is most attractive to the least cognitively able members of our community. And I very much reinforce the point that David Courtwright made, that one of the consequences, or likely consequences, of legalisation is heavy use amongst the most able, the least able people in the community, and its concentration amongst minorities and other groups, which is something that needs to be faced. I'd finish with a couple of observations about what we know from the experience of alcohol regulation. Again, David Courtwright has made some of these points. What we've seen over the last 50 years is the progressive liberalisation of the regulation of alcohol, which is progressively treated as though it was just an ordinary commodity like orange juice or milk, with decreased restrictions on where it's sold and how it can be promoted, lower prices, regulatory capture by industry, an interest in maximising heavy use, and blaming the drinker for the problems, socialising the losses by getting the taxpayer to pick up the bill of policing and dealing with the social costs of heavy alcohol use. And we have the alcohol industry that prefers self-regulation, emphasising education of users, not regulation, and doing all that it can to oppose taxes. I think there's a real worry with corporatisation and for-profit legalisation. We'll see exactly the same trajectory with cannabis here in the US. And I'll just end with some of the health educational challenges that we face if legalisation does prove to be inevitable rather than inevitable. That's providing credible health advice to young people. What are we going to be telling young people now that it's no longer the advice just say no? Use in moderation, or what does that mean? Delay using until adulthood. That's sort of a recipe for a goad to use for many adolescents in a big hurry to become adults. So I think we'll face a lot of the same sorts of problems around education and post-legalisation that we do now with alcohol. The other worrisome thing, I think, is the risk of what might be described as post-repeal amnesia about the risks of regular cannabis use. An understandable reaction to the past exaggerations of the risks of cannabis, as I see a tendency to deny that there's any downside to use, or that there's any pattern of use that can produce harm to some users. And the risk is, as we saw in the 1940s and 1950s, there was a long period when people doubted that alcohol caused liver cirrhosis, or that heavy alcohol use could cause psychosis, or in fact that there was a thing called alcoholism. I think it would be really sad if we ended up replicating that particular history in the way in which we deal with the health consequences, particularly of heavy use of this drug after legalisation. Thanks very much.
Well, thanks to all of you. We have 20 minutes left. We have about 6 hours worth of questions. So I'm gonna both select and shorten. I apologize to anybody whose question either doesn't get asked or gets shortened out of recognition. John, first question to you. You did a calculation of the value of the stoned hours versus the value of avoided arrests and incarcerations based on public budget cost of arrest and incarceration. If you were to add in the damage to the arrestees and their families, how would that calculation change?
Sure. Everybody can do the arithmetic themselves. That's part of why I set it up the way that I did. I think different people have different values, but I think most people, starting with 40 billion and multiplying by a number, will get you to a bigger product than when you start with 40,000 or 700,000.
Okay. You noted that most of the harms are internal. So a questioner asks about drug driving, about violent behavior, about workplace problems.
Yeah, I, of course, in simplifying for the sake of a short talk, there are clearly externalities, but again, I'm trying to make the point that the big potatoes issue is the impact on the user themselves. My sense is, again, that it's a done deal that we're going to legalize. So I think it's a past argument whether or not the externalities are large enough to maintain the prohibition. Right or wrong, American society, I think, has decided it's not going to maintain the prohibition. And so I'm looking forward to what sort of attitude amongst the public generally is a healthy attitude towards this substance, which will no longer have the formal social controls. What sort of informal social controls should we have since we're taking away the formal social controls?
So you mentioned, others have treated daily and near daily use as a marker of problem use. We don't have that view for alcohol, right? We regard a glass of wine at dinner as not a diagnosis. So why should we require daily or near daily cannabis use in a different category from daily or near daily alcohol use?
Well, I think my
answer, everybody.
Yeah, well, I'll go first. My answer on that pie chart was the wedge on the side with people diagnosed with abuse and dependence is clearly in the negative. And then I asked this question for that second biggest wedge of daily, near daily use by adults. And maybe it didn't come across, but I guess I would point to that as one of the most important research questions out there. I think I said I absolutely believe that there are hundreds of thousands of people who use daily and near daily and are completely functional. And then I tried through my little story about my kids to say, I fear that there are some on the other side, and I think that the research literature has not yet done a good job of trying to figure out what proportion of adults who use daily and near daily and who do not themselves voluntarily identify that there are problems are having problems. How much denial is there? I view that as an important unknown.
Yeah, so I'm very interested in this question, and this is part of what this simulation model that I've been working on, it's called SimSimia, and but one of the things that comes out quite clearly, so if you model a dose response function for harms rising with dose, which is standard in pharmacology, and I vary the assumptions about where the threshold is and the shape of the dose response function. Under a wide range of conditions, if you just model the harm per gram and multiply out, but by the fact that the daily users are using a lot more grams, what you find is that a disproportionate amount of the harms will be created by daily users. And that's the same as alcohol. So it is also true that as an actual probability per dose, that I'm looking at very small probabilities of harm per any given dose. Most daily users of alcohol and cannabis have uneventful days where nothing particularly bad goes wrong. But the nature of aggregate risk is that you accumulate overdoses in people, and so inevitably the more doses you take, the more your cumulative risk becomes.
Yeah, I mean, I'd make the point about, I'd agree with what she's just been said. It's a proxy, daily use is a proxy for heavy use. And certainly there probably are people who do use, who have a smoke a joint overnight to relax, like people take a drink. But I think if you look at the heavy use, or the daily uses, it's the wake and bake is the dominant sort of pattern. I'd make the point about alcohol too, is that the recommended guidelines around alcohol are not to drink daily either. As you increase your risk of cirrhosis and cancer from daily, you're better off having a couple of alcohol 3 days a week. And I think the fact that people find it hard not to drink on any days a week or to smoke cannabis on any days a week is a reasonable proxy for problems in controlling this.
I just read an interesting review essay on this question of one glass of wine a day being good for you. In addition to the old argument that there's something about people who can only drink one glass of wine that's a marker for good health. But it turns out that many of these studies are statistically flawed insofar as when they look at abstainers and compare them to people who drink 1 or 2 or 3 times a day, what they discover that the abstainer group includes many people who used to drink heavily and then quit, and so suffered long-term health consequences, which maybe makes taking just 1 drink a day look good. So it's not so sure that this 1 drink a day thing is correct.
I think both from a research point of view and a policy point of view, a huge unanswered question is there a cannabis equivalent, or how common is the cannabis equivalent of taking a drink? And so most alcohol use in the U.S., most occasions of use, don't start with the intention of intoxication and are not in fact intoxication, right? We treat the drinking binge, getting drunk, as a different event from using alcohol. Cannabis, we have not made that distinction. I mean, there's certainly reports of people taking a toke to enjoy the meal better or enjoy the music better. But that does not seem to be a common social pattern. So there's 2 questions. How common is that pattern? How many of those daily users are just taking a toke and never really getting wrecked? But second, are there policies that could introduce that as a new social category to break cannabis away from the getting stoned out of your gourd mold? And that seems to be vastly unexplored territory.
And in particular, when we split one more time, are there policies that can get college-educated people with high degrees of social control to do that? And are there policies that can get the kinds of disadvantaged folks who end up getting in the most trouble with all sorts of intoxicants to consume in that smarter way? Those are very different questions, and my fear would be that we can create a regime in which people with high self-control can continue to exhibit high self-control, but that we will not necessarily be protecting the people who are don't start from a good place.
Am I the only person who can remember the 1970s? and I may be misremembering them, but I actually do think there was a time when people would take a toke or a planetarium show or something like that. Or just, I think there was a time when people did not necessarily get particularly stoned. And I suspect that's much harder to do with today's product, which is just so much more potent than what was it?
So the old National House of Survey on Drug Abuse, before it got to the Vienna's had a question for each drug. When you use drug X, how high do you get? And you could actually do comparisons and model that over time. I think that got dropped, or at least I have not seen any report on that recently. That seems to be a question worth putting back and see what's happening with cannabis. So all the NIDA folks in the audience, please take note. Well, no, but I'm not expecting Samson to do anything sensible. NIDA might actually do some science. General question. John, you located most of the effects of legalization with respect to hours of use. Made a side note that there might be cross effects on other drugs. So what do we think about cross effects on tobacco, on alcohol, on opiates?
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you picked up on that distinction because I think it really is important. The indirect effects on other substances could actually be the most important. And the usual thing is to say, what's it going to do to alcohol? And that's a Rorschach test. The people who like legalization are confident alcohol abuse will go down. The people who don't like legalization are confident it will go up. The research literature is split down the middle. I actually think the interaction with tobacco has a reasonable chance of X post being the really big story. And again, it could go either way. Historically, marijuana and tobacco have been complements, which would make you worry that greater marijuana use will lead to greater tobacco consumption.
And there's actually interaction between nicotine and cannabinoids, is that right? That's what we think?
Yeah, but let me get the other half out, which is the happy story. The potential of legalization to tip the cannabis market from combustion to vaporization, I think, is there. And if tipping all the cannabis consumption from combustion to vaporization is the trigger that's needed to get tobacco consumption or nicotine consumption switched over from combustion to vaporization, the stakes there are enormous, 400,000 deaths per year kind of stakes. So how legalization affects patterns of tobacco use, I think, is a really big unknown and wild card in terms of how we look back on this.
So question, we're increasingly prohibiting tobacco use in public. In that world, what is cannabis use in public going to look like?
Who do you want to have? Who do you want to have answer that?
Anybody who wants to pick it up. I'm reading audience questions, so I didn't deliberately do that to you. Well, do we have a practical option for limiting use in public?
I think the vape technology, I don't know the exact where it started, but whether it started with tobacco and moved, but it seems to have started with marijuana and moved to tobacco. But I think it complicates the story because with these vape pens, I think the public use is less harmful than. Now, of course, there could be social harms in terms of modeling his behavior and so on. But I think as a harm reduction technology, that might make the secondhand smoke.
Yeah, I think that's key. Tobacco combustion secondhand smoke creates a health externality. Vaporized consumption of either nicotine or marijuana creates a less tangible externality of normalizing the use. And there is a real question whether or not that will be viewed as a sufficient basis for banning the public use.
And I could sort of say we already have in Australia, unfortunately. So one of the few people who thinks that's a crazy policy. But I think we may well end up.
I get the mic closer to your mouth.
Sorry, we may well end up with much more restrictive policies towards vaporized tobacco than we do to vaporized cannabis. I think that is a worry because WHO and a lot of CDC and others want to regulate vaporized nicotine products in ways that would be much more restrictive than what we're proposing to do with cannabis.
And we should point out these things are likely to converge. Even today, but maybe more than 10 years, people are going to be mixing up their own. I'll add some THC, I'll add some nicotine, I'll add some blueberry flavoring to the thing I'm going to vape. It's not as if those markets are likely to remain separate post-legalization. They're going to be consumed together.
So we have 5 minutes left, so I have a half-hour question to ask. What marketing effort should we expect from the newly legalized industry? And what are the options on the public side for limiting the damage from that? Public and civil society side.
So initially, the marketing methods are going to be very low tech because the firms are still only in the $10 million a year range. So we're going to go a half dozen years with small dollar marketing. After national legalization, I think it will be likely that the firms will be large precisely because the economies of scale come from trying to maintain a national brand presence. And I think it will be, unlike old-fashioned alcohol and tobacco, it will be much more social media-based product placement in Hollywood movies, not so much the buy television advertising. And however good we are at controlling television advertising, I think we have less experience trying to be public regulators of what happens on social media.
So you're not expecting Bud versus Bud Light on the Super Bowl?
I don't think that'll be the most important part of the marketing strategy. I think the firms might do that, but I think that the exploiting viral social contagion strategies is probably going to be the bigger part of it.
I don't know. I think we're already there. I live in California, and I drive past big electronic signs advertising marijuana, and it's interesting because we used to look to the Dutch as an example of sort of the outer fringes of what's possible, but actually we've already leapfrogged past the Dutch, and there's already more promotion in California, more visible promotion than you would see in most parts of the Netherlands. And it may well be partly because since the Dutch haven't actually legalized, they've got this sort of Damocles hanging over the retailers that they can be shut down. They shut down 40% of their coffee shops, so they have to really toe the line. But in California, we haven't even legalized yet. We just have medical marijuana, and I see advertisements everywhere.
So I'm trying to write a global history of temptation goods, and I spent a lot of time in advertising company archives and also in corporate archives, and across the board I see two tendencies. One is a concerted effort at technological enhancement, for example, by adding flavors to the product. And the other is, I see, a concerted attempt to ramp up the advertising. I wouldn't be surprised to see Bud versus Bud Light in my lifetime. Again, we don't know the future, but if you ask the question, what is the analogy to the history of other temptation goods? There's a lot of money to be made in them, and people have tried to expand the markets.
Just one thought for any state regulators who happen to be out there. Cannabis is still illegal under the Controlled Substances Act. One creative federalism approach that I have not seen anybody try yet is for a state which is legalized either medical or general adult sale, to say, I know Washington State, the lawyers for the liquor board told them that they could not regulate advertising under the free speech clause of the Washington State Constitution. As far as I can tell, what nobody has done is basically say, well, no, we can't actually regulate your advertising, but we do have the phone number of the local DEA office. And any outfit that starts putting up billboards, we're going to put in a phone call. Now, whether the DEA would be prepared to act as the arm of state regulation that way is a question that ought to be addressed.
This is the Russ Belville Show. The Russ Belville Show is blogging and podcasting daily at radicalruss.com.
You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it,